This decade is coming to an end, so it's a time for reflection. Personally, I didn't think it was a great decade for music for me, but it would be ignorant to say that there was no great music, because there was. And now it's time to go through them. My top 10 list of albums of the decade. Now, before I get into this list, let me make it clear. This is my personal list, so if you have any disagreements at all during the video, then that's fine. I mean, your opinions are different to mine, and that is completely fine. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the rules of the list. Right, rule number 1. One album per artist/band. Now, I don't want the whole entire list to be of one specific band. I like to mix it up here and there. So that's why I've applied this rule. Second rule is no live, compilation or cover albums, because original music is better, I think. And third and final rule, no albums from me, because it would probably have a personal bias of number 1 spot on the list. Alright, enough chitter chatter. We're going to get into the honorable mentions before the top 10. So, the first one I have here is James Bay's Electric Light. I thought it was just like a decent record. Nothing really too special. I mean, it's slightly poppy for my taste, but however, I think the songwriting is really good, and I do quite like the instrumentals here and there, even though it's a bit poppy, but I think it's worth a mention. Jack White's Boarding House Reach is... People say that it's a really experimental rock album, and I can see why this album appeals to a lot of people, but in terms of its writing and all that, it just didn't really appeal to us that much, if I gotta be honest. Sam Fender's Hypersonic Missiles deserves an honorable mention just mainly because of the songwriting. Not only that, but he's from my area, which is Newcastle, so yeah, why not? I think Green Day's Revolution Radio is the best Green Day from this decade. Not only that the songs were pretty much straightforward and on to the point, but in terms of its songwriting, it's the best of the decade, and honestly, I'm just kind of scared of what's coming around the corner for the band, because I did not really like the single coming out, but this one I reckon is worth checking out. Black Keys' Let's Rock is an album that I just only checked out very recently because of my band covering one of the songs, Low High, and I decided to check out the whole entire album, and it is a really solid record. I recommend people from the rock genre just to kind of listen to it, because it's just a really decent album. Right, let's get on to the top 10 list. Now, number 10 on the list, I have Billy Cobb. Mainly because I kind of wanted to put him on the list, mainly because that he's just kind of underrated, if I gotta be honest. Not very many people know about him, but if you're a fan of 2000s to late 90s rock, then this is the specific artist for you. Now, the album I'm gonna go with, and I know this is technically an EP, but I did not mention anything about EPs, because there's an album later on that is really good, and it turns out to be an EP, But for number 10, I'm going to go with The Borough, mainly because it's just a really good, solid, EP. I could pretty much listen to this for days upon days upon days. It is really good, and I really recommend worth checking out. Number 9 on the list, I've got Slipknot's We Are Not Your Kind. Now, Slipknot have been coming out with 2 decent albums for this decade. One of them is number 5, The Grey Chapter, which you kind of see the band taking like a different direction in terms of its sound. But the problem is with that album is that it doesn't have the aggression of the early albums, and in turn kind of sounds a bit weak. But this one has elements of the Great Chapter seeped in, but however it does call back to this, like the early albums, you know, the self-titled and Iowa, and it's so theatrical and so intense that I cannot just stop admiring it because of it. Now, number 8 on the spot is Marilyn Manson's The Pale Emperor. Now, out of the 3 albums that Marilyn Manson put out in this decade, I could be wrong, but out of the 3, I think Pale Emperor is the most solid one out of all the albums that he put out this decade. While the last one wasn't, I mean, I kind of reflect back on it and say, I decently enjoyed it, but I don't know, Pale Emperor just tends to be a lot more rememberable as an experience. And a lot of the songwriting, it just kind of is different compared to his earlier stuff, but it isn't, like, it feels like it's more mature than his, like, older albums, even though his older albums were tackling mature and intensive subjects. This one takes the subjects, but it takes it in like a realistic light, and that's why I like it. 9 Inch Nails, Not the Actual Events. What can I say about this EP other than it's really cryptic? Like, even to this day, I am still puzzled on, like, the EP that they put out, because it's, like, a lot like their marketing. It is just, like, really strange and just, like, so bizarre that I have to put on the list. I mean, Added Violence was kind of more of the same, and Bad Witch I thought it was okay at best, but I think the one that I tend to go back to the most is Not the Actual Events, mainly because it just kind of puzzles me a lot of the time. Now, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Skeleton Tree. Now, Nick Cave did put out a really sad album recently, and to me, it's just too much of a boring album. And I am disappointed by that, because the previous album to that, Skeleton Tree, was like really sad in a lot of the similar ways that Ghost Teen was. But however, it's kind of atmospheric. It's very confrontive, but it's not at the same time. Like, the instrumentals give like an atmospheric sort of feel to the record, but it doesn't sound boring in the process of that. Like, it keeps you interested and it makes you want to listen on to what he's saying. But the way that Nick Cave performs his vocals is kind of the kicker to me, because during the recording process, his son died during the making of it, and you can pretty much tell throughout the album that he's pretty much crumbling up inside, and it's just an emotional like thing to listen to. And it doesn't sound like over emotional where his vocals sound crap in the process. It's emotional in the sense that you can actually feel the way he's speaking through just the sounds of his band and his voice. Radiohead's A Moon-Shaped Pool. Now, it's very similar to Nick Cave's Skeleton Tree in that it dwells on a lot of the sadness, but I think this is better because it does have the brighter moments to help you carry through the album, where Nick Cave and the Bad Seed Skeleton Tree, it dwells on sadness. This one does, but it has a few bright moments here and there, and therefore kind of makes you want to continue with the album. And not only that, but the opening track, Burn the Witch, is just one of the best Radiohead songs, I think. Well, there's a lot of really good Radiohead songs, but this one, for its decade, I think it's really good, and is well worth checking out. Avenged Sevenfold's Nightmare. Now, usually, I'm not a very metal person. Like, I'm heavily inspired by a lot of the rock gods of, like, the 60s, 80s, and all that. But back when I was a teenager, back early this decade, I mean, my favorite album to rock out to was like Nightmare. The writing is like spot on. The instrumentation is just really intense, and not only that, but it is a tribute to one of my favorite drummers of all time, which is the Rev, which he died during like the making of this record, and you can see with some of the tracks on Nightmare some of the sadness it hit to the band, but yet they're still carried on through, and they made like a great album in the process. Now, the Foo Fighters' Wasting Light may come as a surprise, because I did mention in my vinyl record collection video that I only like the singles, but after that video, when I realized that the decade was coming to an end, I quickly managed to find this album in my like Spotify collection of albums. Like, it was there just to listen to, so I figured before the decade ends, like, I would literally check it out before the decade ends. And I did. And I think this is the best Foo Fighters record, hands down. Like, this is the one that is intense, the one that is really fun and just energetic to listen to. Like, and not only that, but the production, I mean, it's recorded through analog, and to me, a lot of old recordings tend to sound a lot more lively, because they tend to sound like rough around the edges, but with some of them, it's not too rough, and nor too clean either, so it's like, you're kind of getting like the best of both worlds, and this record is a highlight of that. Clean enough where it sounds, you know, really good when it needs to, but not too clean that it loses like a lot of the intensity out of a rough production. And this is a really great line to balance on. Give this record a listen. Queens of the Stone Age, Like Clockwork. Now, this would have been number one if it weren't for a certain someone making their last album ever made. But Queens of the Stone Age, while Josh Homme came out of a tragic accident, he still pulled through and made like a really great album. Like, this is pretty much one of the albums that one of the rock albums that if I would be asked what rock record would you go back to like every decade, every year, and I would say Like Clockwork, because this record is just amazing from start to finish, and it's just a unique experience pretty much from this decade. This album would have been number one if it weren't for David Bowie's Black Star. Loads of people have gone on about how great it is, so I'll pretty much not say any more than what I need to. This album is huge, it is magnificent, almost perfect in a lot of ways. of like a career-ending album. Like, this is like the best album you could go out on before you can move on with your life. And with David Bowie, he's moving on to the afterlife. And the last thing that he gave to us as fans was this album, and it's one of the best gifts that his fans could receive, I think. And yeah, I hope he's doing well in the afterlife. So that is a list of the top 10 albums of the decade. What do you think? Would you perhaps agree with me, or do you disagree with me and lay it out very differently? Well, let us know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video, or whatever I make. Thank you so much for listening, and see you later.